On the 15th of October 2014, Warner Bros. Put out a press release. It was not a trailer, it was not a teaser, there was no music over it. It was a list. 10 DC films, each one with a year attached to it, stretching out to 2020. 2 of the films on that list do not exist. One of them was a cyborg movie, penciled in for 2020. The other was Green Lantern Corps, same year. Neither of them was ever made, and at the time that list went out, a fair few of the ones that did get made had no script, no director, and in some cases no cast. So that is where we're going tonight. 10 years of one film franchise, from a press release to a full reboot, told slowly and in order, with a lot of small details along the way. Nothing here needs your full attention. If you drift off around 2016, you have my blessing. Right then, let's start a bit earlier than 2014, because the list did not come out of nowhere. To understand why a studio would publish 6 years of release dates in one go, you have to understand what the previous 8 years had been like for Warner Bros. And Superman specifically. Because they had been trying. They had been trying for a long time, and it had not been going well. In 2006, they released Superman Returns, directed by Bryan Singer, who had just come off 2 X-Men films, and was at that point one of the most trusted people in the genre. The film was a sort of soft continuation of the Christopher Reeve movies, reverent almost to a fault, with Brandon Routh doing a very deliberate impression of Reeve's whole manner. It made a bit under 400 million worldwide, which sounds fine until you learn what it cost. Warner did not make a sequel. They spent years trying to work out what to do instead. And there is a whole genre of Hollywood article about the Superman scripts that were commissioned and abandoned during that period. Some of them are wild. There was, famously, a version where Superman does not wear the suit. Then in 2011, there was Green Lantern. I have a genuine soft spot for this film, in the way you have a soft spot for a dog that keeps walking into doors. But it did not work. Ryan Reynolds in a CGI costume, a villain who is essentially a large brown cloud, and a studio that had clearly decided the release date first and worked backwards from it. Sound familiar? It made about 220 million on a budget somewhere around 200, which in blockbuster maths means it lost money, and the sequel that had been quietly assumed simply evaporated. And running alongside all of this, in a completely separate lane, was Christopher Nolan doing Batman. The Dark Knight in 2008 made $1 billion. The Dark Knight Rises in 2012 made $1 billion. Those films were enormous, and they were also pointedly not connected to anything else. Nolan's Gotham did not have aliens in it. It did not wink at a wider world. When Warner asked him about tying it into something bigger, the answer was, essentially, no. So by 2012, Warner Bros. Had the most successful superhero films on the planet, and absolutely no way to build on them, because the man who made them had deliberately built them so you could not. And that same year, in May, Marvel released The Avengers. I do not think people fully remember how strange that felt at the time. 6 films had been building toward it over 4 years, and a lot of people, including a lot of people in the industry, assumed it would not land. Crossing over 4 separate franchises into one film was the sort of thing comics did, and cinema did not. Then it made $1.5 billion, and every studio in Los Angeles spent the next 18 months in meetings about what their version of that would be. Which brings us to Man of Steel in June 2013. Zack Snyder directing, Christopher Nolan producing, David Goyer writing, Henry Cavill in the suit, Hans Zimmer doing a score that, whatever you think of the film, is genuinely brilliant. That main theme still gets to me. It builds out of almost nothing, just this quiet repeated figure, and then about 90 seconds in the drums come in, and you can feel a room full of executives deciding they have a franchise. The film made around 668 million worldwide against a budget of roughly 225. That is a solid result. Not a spectacular one, not $1 billion, but comfortably profitable and a significant step up from where Superman had been sitting. And here is the thing about Man of Steel that I find genuinely fascinating, which is that 13 years on, people are still arguing about it. Not in a nostalgic way, actively arguing. There is a very large group of people who consider it the best Superman film ever made, and an equally large group who think it fundamentally misunderstands the character. The argument tends to land on the same 3 or 4 things every time. The colour grading. The bit where Jonathan Kent tells young Clark that maybe he should have let a bus full of children drown. The last 20 minutes in which a very large amount of Metropolis is destroyed. And the neck. If you have not seen it, I will not spoil the specific beat, but there is a moment at the end that broke a rule a lot of people did not realise they cared about until it happened. And the interesting thing is that the film knows it is doing it. It is not an accident. Cavill plays it as the worst moment of the character's life. Whether that was the right call is exactly the argument, and I am not going to settle it at whatever time it is where you are. What matters for our purposes is that Warner Brothers looked at that result and at that argument and concluded they had something to build on. So they built fast. The first public sign came at Comic-Con in July 2013, about a month after Man of Steel came out. Snyder came out on stage, and Harry Lennox read a passage from The Dark Knight Returns, the Frank Miller comic, out loud to the room. And then a logo came up, the Superman shield and the bat symbol overlapping. By all accounts, the noise in that hall was extraordinary, and what had actually just been announced, if you stripped the theatre away, was that the Superman sequel was not going to be a Superman sequel. It was going to be Batman as well. The follow-up to a film that had done reasonably well was being asked to do considerably more work. Then in August they cast Ben Affleck as Batman, and the internet, briefly, lost its mind. There was a petition. There is always a petition. This was the same Ben Affleck who had been in Daredevil in 2003, which people had not forgiven, and who had, in the intervening decade, won an Academy Award for producing Argo and directed 3 genuinely good films, which people had apparently forgotten. It is a nice reminder of how quickly the online reaction to a casting decision ages. Affleck's Batman is, for a lot of people, the single best part of what came next. Then Gal Gadot was cast as Wonder Woman in the same film. So now the follow-up to Man of Steel was carrying Superman, Batman and Wonder Woman, and setting up a team-up and establishing several more characters on the side. And then came the list. October the 15th, 2014, at a Time Warner investor meeting. Kevin Tsujihara, who was chairman and chief executive of Warner Brothers, laid out what the company called an aggressive content strategy. There were Lego films on the list, there were Fantastic Beasts films, and there were, as the release put it, at least 10 DC movies from 2016 through to 2020. I want to read some of it out, because the shape of it is the whole story. Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, directed by Zack Snyder, 2016. Suicide Squad, directed by David Ayer, 2016. Wonder Woman, starring Gal Gadot, 2017. Justice League Part 1, directed by Zack Snyder, 2017. The Flash, starring Ezra Miller, 2018. Aquaman, starring Jason Momoa, 2018. Shazam, 2019. Justice League Part 2, directed by Zack Snyder, 2019. Cyborg, starring Ray Fisher, 2020. Green Lantern Corps, 2020. Now, some of that came true. Batman v Superman came out in 2016 as promised. Suicide Squad came out in 2016 as promised. Wonder Woman came out in 2017. 1 year late by a matter of weeks, near enough. But look at the back half. The Flash, listed for 2018, came out in 2023. Justice League. Part 2, listed for 2019, never happened. Cyborg never happened. Green Lantern Corps never happened. Aquaman made 2018 and Shazam made 2019. So it is not a total wipeout, but you are still looking at a plan where roughly half the second wave either arrived years late or did not arrive at all. And the thing I keep coming back to, the reason I opened with this, is that these were announced as products with delivery dates to investors in a room where the point is to make people confident. Green Lantern Corps did not have a script in October 2014. It did not have a director. There was no cyborg screenplay sitting in a drawer somewhere. What existed was a slot in a year, and a confidence that the slot would get filled. Marvel had done something similar, to be fair. They had announced phases and dates, and stood on stages with slides. But there is a difference between announcing dates for films that are already in development under one supervising producer who has been building the thing since 2007, and announcing dates for a universe that is currently 2 films old and being assembled while it runs. There is a lovely bit of context I only came across while reading around this, which is that the same investor presentation was where Warner talked up its plans across kids programming and international expansion and cable production. The DC list was one bullet point in a much larger pitch about the company doubling down on content, which is exactly what it was. It was a corporate confidence document that happened to be about superheroes, and the internet read it as a promise. Sort of like how a friend tells you in January that this is the year they're going to run a marathon and learn Portuguese. Nothing about the statement is dishonest. It is genuinely the plan. It is just that the plan has not met anything yet. And there is one more thing about that period that I think is worth mentioning, because it explains the confidence. In 2014, Warner Brothers had a problem that most studios would have loved to have, which is that its 2 biggest reliable franchises were both ending. The final Harry Potter film had come out in 2011. The Nolan Batman trilogy finished in 2012. Between them, those 2 things had generated an absolutely enormous amount of money over a decade, and both of them were now done. The Fantastic Beasts films on that same October list were the replacement plan for one of those holes. DC was the replacement plan for the other, so the 10-film slate was not just enthusiasm about superheroes. It was a company standing in front of investors and saying, "Do not worry about the gap, here is what fills it, and here are the years." Which makes the whole thing a bit more sympathetic, honestly. It was not arrogance, it was a studio that needed a large, dependable, decade-long thing, looking across town at a rival who had one, and deciding it could build the same in less time. And you can see why they thought so. They had better-known characters. Superman and Batman are genuinely more famous than Iron Man was in 2008. It is not close. If you asked 100 people on a street anywhere in the world in 2013 to name a superhero, you would get Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man. And then a long pause. That is the thing that made this so frustrating for everyone involved, I think. The assets were the best ones. The library was unmatched. Warner had been sitting on those characters since 1969 and had been making Batman films since 1989, competently, on and off, for decades. There is a lovely comparison to be made with how Marvel got where it was, which was essentially by having no other option. They had sold the film rights to their most famous characters in the 90s to stay solvent. Spider-Man was at Sony, the X-Men and the Fantastic Four were at Fox. So when Marvel Studios started making its own films, it had to start with Iron Man, who at the time was a second-tier character most of the audience could not have described, and build patiently from there because there was nothing else to build with. Warner had the opposite problem, which is that it had the good ones. And when you have the good ones, patience is very hard to argue for in a meeting. Nobody wants to hear that you should introduce Superman, and then Batman, and then Wonder Woman, and then team them up over 8 years, when all 3 of them are already on lunchboxes. So the plan compressed. Batman and Superman got put in one film. Wonder Woman got put in that film too. The team-up came 4th instead of 7th. And every one of those decisions is completely defensible on its own. And together, they add up to a universe that had to sprint from the moment it started walking. Anyway, that is the setup. A studio with a decade of Superman frustration behind it. A Batman trilogy it could not extend. A rival that had just proved the model works. One film that made money and started an argument. And a list of 10 titles with years attached. The first of those years was 2016. So let's go and see what happened when the date actually arrived. Batman v Superman. Dawn of Justice opened on the 25th of March, 2016, and for about 72 hours, it was the biggest thing in the world. The opening weekend was $166 million in North America. At the time, that was the biggest launch a comic book film had ever had. Bigger than any Avengers opening to that point. It set the March record. It was the largest domestic opening Warner Brothers had ever had for anything, and Warner Brothers had Harry Potter. Worldwide, the first weekend brought in more than $420 million. If you were following box office numbers that Sunday, and I was because I have always been the sort of person who reads box office numbers on a Sunday, it looked like the plan had worked. The list was real. Everything after this was going to be fine. Then the second weekend happened. The film dropped 69%. It went from 166 million to about 51. For a big superhero release, that number is not just bad, it is historically bad. It ties X-Men Origins, Wolverine for the second steepest second weekend fall ever recorded for a marquee superhero title. The only one worse in that category was Ang Lee's Hulk in 2003, which fell about 70. For comparison, because comparison is the only way these percentages mean anything, Avengers, Age of Ultron dropped around 59, The Dark Knight dropped 52, Man of Steel, Snyder's own film 3 years earlier, dropped about 65, and people had commented on that at the time. Warner did point out correctly that the opening figure included nearly $28 million from Thursday night previews, which inflates the first weekend and makes the second look worse than it is. That is a fair point. It does not get you from 69 down to something normal, but it is a fair point. What was actually happening was word of mouth, and word of mouth was not good. The reviews had landed at 29% on Rotten Tomatoes. The cinema score, which is the exit poll they run with actual audiences on opening night, came back a B. A B sounds fine if you're getting your homework marked. For a film with Batman and Superman in the title, it is one of the worst grades either character has ever received, and it is the number studios actually watch, because it predicts the second weekend better than the critics do. The film finished at around 873 million worldwide, which I want to be clear is a lot of money. It is more than Man of Steel by a comfortable margin. On almost any other project, that is a win. But it was carrying about $250 million of budget, depending on which report you believe, plus a marketing spend reported in the region of 150. And more importantly, it was carrying the entire list. This was meant to be the film that made everything after it inevitable. Instead, it was the film that made everyone inside the building nervous. Now, let's talk about the film itself for a bit, because I have thoughts and I have been sitting on them for the whole of this section. There is a version of Batman v Superman that I think is genuinely good, and the frustrating thing is that it is visibly inside the one that came out. Affleck is excellent. He is playing a Batman about 20 years into the job, physically enormous, exhausted, cruel, in a way the character usually is not allowed to be. There is a warehouse fight near the end that is probably the best Batman action sequence ever put on film, and I will happily die on that hill. It is one continuous feeling take of a man who is very, very good at his job, doing his job. Jeremy Irons as Alfred is doing something nobody else has done with the role, which is treating Bruce Wayne like a colleague he has stopped being able to talk sense into. Zimmer and Junkie XL's Wonder Woman theme, that electric cello thing, is the single most effective piece of character introduction in the entire franchise, and it is doing that work in about 8 seconds. And then there is the rest of it. The film is trying to be a Superman sequel, a Batman debut, a Wonder Woman introduction, a Justice League trailer, a Doomsday movie, and an adaptation of The Dark Knight Returns, all at once in about 2.5 hours. Lex Luthor's plan requires several people to behave in ways nobody has ever behaved. There is a dream sequence inside a dream sequence with a man from the future in it, and it is explaining a plot point for a film that would not come out for 7 years. And the thing about the mothers' names, I am not going to relitigate it, everyone has decided, but it is a genuinely interesting example of a scene that reads completely differently depending on whether you have the 20 minutes of setup that got cut, which brings me neatly to my favourite bit of trivia in this whole section. Because there is another version. In July 2016, 4 months after the theatrical release, Warner put out the Ultimate Edition on home video. 3 hours long, 31 minutes of restored footage, R-rated, because some of the restored material was violent. And it is, materially, a different film. Not a better film in every respect. It is very long, and it does not fix the ending. But it restores an entire subplot about a journalist investigating Luthor. It fills in why several characters are where they are when they are, and a number of things that readers sloppy in the theatrical cut turn out to have had connective tissue that was removed. Here is the fun detail. Snyder has said the 3-hour version was essentially the film as assembled, and the theatrical cut was the one made to fit a runtime. So the version most of the film's defenders point to when they defend it is a version that almost nobody saw in a cinema, which is a strange position for a film to be in, and, as we will get to eventually, not the last time this exact situation came up in this franchise. Now let's talk a little about what the studio did next, because this is where the pattern starts. In May 2016, about 6 weeks after Batman vs Superman opened, Warner Bros. Created a new internal division called DC Films. Jeff Johns, who had been Chief Creative Officer at DC Entertainment, and who knows the comics as well as anybody alive, was put in charge alongside John Berg, a Warner production executive. The stated purpose was to bring oversight and consistency to the film slate, which sounds sensible. Marvel had exactly that, in the form of Kevin Feige and a producer structure that had been in place for years. Warner was essentially going, right, we should have one of those, but look at the timing. The division designed to supervise the universe was created after the second film in the universe came out. 2 of the 10 films on the list were already released. A third was in post-production. A fourth was shooting. The supervision arrived after the thing being supervised was well underway, which is a bit like hiring a project manager on the day the scaffolding goes up. And there is one more thing about that spring that I find genuinely a bit sad, which is what it did to the tone conversation. Because the reaction to Batman vs Superman was not just that it was badly reviewed, it was specifically that it was dour. Joyless was the word that kept coming up. Too grey, too grim, nobody smiles. Whether that is a fair reading is arguable. There is plenty of humour in it, and Affleck's Batman has one of the funniest line deliveries in the whole franchise. But it does not matter whether it was fair, because it became the received wisdom within about a week. And from that moment on, for years, every decision this franchise made about tone was a reaction to that one review cycle. Not a decision about what a given film should be. A reaction, lighter, funnier, more colour, more jokes. You can trace it through everything that follows. And the very first film it hit was already 6 weeks from its first test screening. Since we are on the subject of that spring, there is a small thing about the film's release that I have always found quietly telling. Batman v Superman opened on the 25th of March, which was Good Friday. Easter weekend is a strong slot in a lot of markets, and Warner had cleared it deliberately. Nothing else of any size opened against it. The following weekend, the one where it fell 69%, the biggest new wide release was a faith-based comedy sequel. There was nothing pulling the audience away. The audience simply did not come back. That is the part studios actually pay attention to. A film can fall a long way in weekend 2 because a bigger film arrived, and that is survivable. A film that falls a long way with an empty calendar in front of it is telling you something about itself. And I do think there is a slightly unfair dimension to how that number gets used, which I want to acknowledge because I have been leaning on it fairly hard. Front-loading was already becoming a general trend by 2016. Big genre films increasingly made most of their money in the first 10 days because everybody who cared went immediately, and the second weekend drops across the whole industry were getting steeper year on year. Batman v Superman is an extreme case of a real trend, not a unique failure of nature. What it did do, though, was arrive at exactly the moment when Warner needed evidence that the plan was working, and provide evidence that it was not. Timing is a lot of what makes a number matter. There is one more piece of context from that spring that gets left out, and that I think is genuinely relevant, which is what else was happening in the genre that year. Deadpool had come out in February, made about $780 million, on a budget of around 58, and been an enormous critical and commercial surprise. Captain America: Civil War came out in May, 6 weeks after Batman v Superman, and made $1.15 billion. And Civil War is, structurally, the same film. Two heroes the audience loves are put in opposition over a disagreement about accountability and collateral damage. They fight, and they are reconciled by a third party revealing a manipulation. So Warner had the misfortune of releasing a hero versus hero film 6 weeks before the definitive hero versus hero film of that decade. And the comparisons were immediate and constant and, for the people who made it, presumably unbearable. Every review that spring made them. Civil War had 8 years and 12 films of relationships behind it, and Batman v Superman had 1 film and a lot of ambition, and the comparison did not care. I do not think you can separate the internal reaction that sprang from that. It was not just 29%, it was 29%, and then a rival doing the same premise properly, in public, a month and a half later. I said we would keep this in order, so I will not jump ahead, but I do want to leave this section with the one number that I think tells the whole story of that spring better than the 69% does: $873 million. That is what Batman v Superman made, and Warner Bros. Treated it, internally, as a crisis. They restructured the division. They panicked about tone. They started rewriting films that were already shooting. There is an executive quote from that summer, given anonymously to The Hollywood Reporter, describing Tsujihara as, and I quote, "really pissed about damage to the brand." That is the mood in the building over a film that grossed the best part of $900 million. I do not think that is unreasonable exactly. When you have published a list of 10 films and the flagship gets 29%, you are allowed to be worried. But there is a difference between being worried and reorganizing around the worry, and this was very much the second one. Anyway, that reorganization and that panic both landed immediately and hardest on a film that was in the middle of post-production at that exact moment. So let's talk about Suicide Squad. Suicide Squad is the film I would point at if somebody asked me to explain, in one go, what actually went wrong with this whole enterprise. Not because it is the worst film, it is not. And not because it lost the most money, it did not. It made money. It is because everything that went wrong is visible, on the surface, and the reporting on it is unusually good. So, The film was announced on that October 2014 list with a release date attached, August 2016. David Ayer was hired to write and direct. Ayer is a proper filmmaker. He wrote Training Day. He directed End of Watch and Fury, both of which are excellent, both of which are grim, grounded, sweaty films about men in enclosed spaces making bad decisions. If you were building a Dirty Dozen film about disposable criminals sent on a suicide mission, he is a genuinely inspired choice. He had 6 weeks to write the script. That is not me being cute with a number. A source with ties to the production told The Hollywood Reporter in an August 2016 piece by Kim Masters that remains the best thing written about this film, and I am quoting directly here. He wrote the script in like 6 weeks, and they just went. 6 weeks on a $200 million tentpole with an ensemble of about 9 characters, most of whom the general public had never heard of, which needed to introduce all of them, establish a chain of command, run a heist plot, and land an emotional arc. And this is the concept I want to lay out properly, because it explains more of this story than anything else. And once I have said it, I am not going to keep saying it. I will just nod at it when it comes up again. Here is the thing. In a normal film, the process runs: idea, script, budget, schedule, release date. The date is the last thing you decide, because the date depends on how long the thing takes to make. Warner Bros. Ran it backwards. The release date existed first because the release date was in a press release, and the press release had gone to investors, and once a date is public, a lot of other things attach themselves to it. Toy manufacturers plan around it, international distributors book screens around it, brand partners sign contracts around it. Another source in that same piece put it plainly: it is not just that you have told the public the movie is coming, you have made huge deals around the world with huge branding partners, with merchandise partners. It is a really big deal to move a tentpole date, so the date cannot move, which means everything upstream of the date gets compressed until it fits. The script gets 6 weeks. Pre-production overlaps with casting. Post-production overlaps with reshoots. And because none of it had room to breathe, every problem discovered along the way gets solved with money and panic instead of time. That is the mechanism. That is the whole thing. And once you can see it in almost every film we are going to talk about tonight. Right, back to the squad. Filming, by most accounts, went reasonably well. Will Smith and Margot Robbie were both fresh off making Focus together and had a genuine rapport. Robbie's Harley Quinn was, and I think this is uncontroversial now, the best thing to come out of the entire franchise in terms of pure character creation. She played that part in 4 separate films across 7 years, and she was the best thing in all of them. Then in July 2015 came Comic-Con, and this is where the story gets properly interesting. Ayer and the cast turned up and showed a sizzle reel. Now, a sizzle reel is not a trailer. It is a thing you cut for a room of 6,000 devoted people who are already on your side, and it is not meant to leave the building. It leaked within hours in the way these things always do, as a shaky, low-resolution phone recording, and Warner had to make a decision. Do you let the terrible version live on the internet as the first footage anyone has seen of your film, or do you release the good version and pretend that was always the plan? They released the good version, which was honestly the right call, but it meant the first real look at Suicide Squad was a piece of footage cut for a hall of fans, dark and heavy and menacing, and that set an expectation. Then in January 2016, the actual trailer arrived, and it was a phenomenon. It was cut to Bohemian Rhapsody. Every character got a little title card in scribbled handwriting. It was fast and bright and irreverent, and it made the film look like an absolute riot. People watched it 50 times. I watched it more than 50 times. It is, taken on its own terms, one of the best trailers of the decade. The trailer was cut by a company called Trailer Park. Remember that. Because 2 months later, Batman v Superman came out, got 29%, and the mood inside Warner Bros. Became what we talked about in the last section, and executives went and watched the cut of Suicide Squad that Ayer had made, and then they went and watched the trailer that everybody loved, and they noticed that the two things did not feel like the same film. Ayer's cut was in the register of an Ayer film. Serious, character-driven, reasonably dark. The trailer was a party. So Warner Brothers hired Trailer Park to cut a version of the film. Not a trailer, the film. The company that made the 2-minute advert was brought in to assemble an entire alternative edit of a feature, with the jazzy title cards, and the character introductions moved earlier, and a generally lighter feel. And Ayer, who by the reporting was a knowing participant in this rather than a victim of it, continued working on his own version at the same time. Then both versions were tested in front of audiences, as late as May, 3 months before release. I find this genuinely extraordinary, and I want to be fair about it, because studios test multiple cuts all the time, and it is not inherently sinister. An insider in that same Hollywood Reporter piece described it in very reasonable terms. If there are multiple opinions that are not in sync, you go down multiple tracks, 2 tracks at least. That is a normal thing to say. It sounds like project management. But the thing being managed was a film, and the 2 tracks were 2 different films, and the resolution was to build a third film that was somewhere between them, which required millions of dollars of additional photography, 3 months out. The word used about Ayer in the reporting is exhausted. Under a lot, and there is a dash, and then the word a lot repeated, of pressure. Panic and ego is the phrase used about the wider process, and you can see all of it in the finished film. The first 30 minutes introduce the characters twice, once through Amanda Waller's dossiers, and once through the title cards, because both versions of that sequence survived the merge. The Joker subplot is clearly a much larger thing that has been reduced to fragments. There is a scene in a bar in the middle where everyone sits down and explains their feelings out loud, which is the exact scene a film has when someone has decided it needs more heart and there is no time to build it properly. Jared Leto's Joker deserves a paragraph of its own, really. He famously stayed in character, sent his co-stars unpleasant gifts, and did a lot of press about how committed he was. And then most of it was cut. He is in the finished film for about 10 or 12 minutes. Whatever you think of the performance, and I think it is a fascinating swing that does not land, the amount of discourse generated per minute of screen time is probably an industry record. The film came out on the 5th of August, 2016. Reviews were poor, around 26%, and it made $749 million, which I love honestly, because it complicates the story in a way that a neat decline narrative does not want. The audience showed up. Harley Quinn became a Halloween costume for about a decade. The soundtrack went platinum. On a budget of $175 million, that is a hit. It also won an Academy Award for makeup and hairstyling at the 2017 ceremony. So Suicide Squad is technically and permanently an Oscar-winning film. Every time somebody sets up a joke about it, I remember that, and it stops being funny, which is its own kind of funny. There is one more detail from that summer that I think is quietly the saddest thing in this section. Just weeks before those 2 competing cuts were tested, Warner Bros. Declined to finance Ayer's next project, a film called Bright that was going to reunite him with Will Smith. He took it to Netflix instead, who paid a reported $90 million for it. So while he was in the middle of fighting for his own edit of their $200 million film, the studio he was fighting with had just passed on his next one. That is a rough spring at the office. Now let's talk a little about the soundtrack, because it is a genuinely fascinating artifact of exactly this problem. Suicide Squad has one of the most aggressive needle-drop scores of the decade. There is a licensed song roughly every 4 minutes in the first half. Bohemian Rhapsody, Sympathy for the Devil, House of the Rising Sun, Seven Nation Army, Ballroom Blitz, Fortunate Son. It is essentially a very expensive playlist with a film attached, and the reason it exists is straightforwardly commercial. Guardians of the Galaxy had come out in 2014, and its soundtrack had gone to #1 on the Billboard album chart, which had not happened for a film without original songs in about 20 years. That was noticed. Every studio in town spent the following 18 months trying to get one. But here is the difference, and it is the whole thing. In Guardians, the music is a plot point. It is a cassette from a dead mother that the character carries around. There is a reason for every song being there in the film, inside the story. In Suicide Squad, the songs are there because songs work. And you can feel that. The music never quite sits on the images. It is telling you how to feel a beat and a half before the scene has earned it, which is a trailer's job, not a film's. Which brings us back neatly to who was in the edit. The soundtrack, incidentally, did extremely well. It went platinum. 21 Pilots put out a song called Heathens that spent months in the charts and is, by some distance, the most successful thing associated with the film. So it worked exactly as intended as a commercial exercise, which I suspect is why the approach stuck around for a good few years afterwards. There is one other thing about this film I want to mention because it is a small piece of history that gets forgotten. Viola Davis as Amanda Waller is, for my money, the single most accurate comics-to-screen casting in the entire franchise. Waller is a government official who runs a program built on blackmailing people with bombs in their necks, and the character only works if the actor can make you believe that everyone in the room is genuinely frightened of a woman with no powers and a folder. Davis does it in about 2 scenes. There is a moment in a restaurant that I will not spoil, which establishes exactly what she is, and it is the only scene in the film where the tone is unambiguous. She has played the part in 3 films now across 2 different continuities, which makes her one of the very few things to survive the entire run of this story intact. When we get to the reboot, most of the cast changes over. Waller does not. Small mercies and all that. Aya has talked about his own cut on and off ever since. There is a campaign for it, in the way there are now campaigns for everything. And he has, at points, asked people to ease off it so as not to step on other people's releases, which I think says something decent about him. Anyway, 2 films in and the pattern is established. A date that cannot move, a script written at speed, a tone dictated by the reaction to a different film, and a final cut assembled by committee. The next film out of the door was Wonder Woman, which nobody at the studio was watching all that closely, and which turned out fine. So let's talk about that one for a while. I want to start this one with a single scene, because I think it explains more than any amount of production history would. About an hour into Wonder Woman, Diana and Steve Trevor and their small band of extremely disreputable colleagues arrive at a trench on the Western Front. There is a village on the other side of the mud that has been occupied for a year. A local woman is describing what has happened to the people in it, and Steve explains, patiently and correctly, that there is nothing they can do, because the strip of ground between the 2 trench lines is no man's land, and nobody crosses it. That is the whole point of it. That is what the phrase means. And Diana takes off her coat and climbs the ladder anyway. Then there is a full minute of her walking into machine gun fire with a shield, and the men behind her realising that if she is not stopping, they are not stopping either. And by the end of it, they have taken the village. Here is the fun detail. That sequence very nearly did not exist. It was flagged during development as a problem because it does not make tactical sense. She is one person. She cannot hold the line alone. It slows the film down, and it does not advance the plot much. On paper, cutting it is the correct note. Patty Jenkins fought for it and kept it, and it is the moment the entire film exists for. It is the scene people describe when they describe why they cried. It is Wonder Woman as a character. in one gesture. Someone tells her it is impossible, and she goes anyway, and the going is the point. That, to me, is the whole difference between this film and the two we have just spent 40 minutes on. Somebody had a specific, personal, slightly illogical idea about what the film was and was allowed to keep it. Right, let's talk about how it got made. The film had been on that October 2014 list with a 2017 date, and at that point it did not have a director. It went through one before it settled. Michelle McLaren was attached and departed in April 2015 over the usual phrase, creative differences, and Patty Jenkins was hired within about a fortnight. Jenkins had directed Monster in 2003, which won Charlize Theron an Academy Award, and then remarkably had not directed a feature since. 13 years. She had been doing television, including the pilot of The Killing, and she had at one point been attached to Thor, The Dark World, and left that too. So she came to this with an Oscar-winning film on her CV and a decade of not being given another one. The budget was around $149 million, which, and I want to sit on this for a second, is a genuinely small number in this context. Suicide Squad had 175. Batman v Superman had 250. Wonder Woman was the cheapest film in the franchise's first wave by a wide margin, and it was the one carrying the first female-led superhero blockbuster in about a decade, after Elektra and Catwoman had done such comprehensive damage to that idea in the mid-2000s that studios treated it as settled. And it was set in 1918. I think the period setting is quietly the most important decision in the film, and it is one of those things that is very easy to miss, because setting it during the First World War meant the film could not do continuity homework. There is no way to put a cameo from another character in it. There is no post-credits scene setting up a team-up. There is no news report about the events of a previous film. It is structurally impossible for it to be part of a universe, because everybody else in the universe is not born yet. So it got left alone. Not out of generosity, out of geometry. And this is the thing I have been building toward, and I will say it once properly, and then leave it be. The least connected film in the connected universe was the best received one. Not by a small margin either. Wonder Woman came out on the 2nd of June, 2017, 92% on Rotten Tomatoes. Around $822 million worldwide against that $149 million budget, which is a ratio nothing else in the franchise got close to. It became the highest grossing live-action film solo directed by a woman, and held that until Barbie in 2023. The American Film Institute put it in their top 10 films of the year, which is not a thing superhero films generally get. It won the Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation. Jenkins re-signed for the sequel after several months of negotiation at a reported $7 to $9 million, which made her the highest paid female filmmaker in history at that point. Which is a lovely fact, and also when you look at the number next to what male directors of comparable hits were on, a slightly bleak one. Now, I am not going to sit here and tell you the film is flawless, because it is not. And the flaw is quite a specific one. The third act turns into a large digital man fighting another large digital man in an orange fireball, which is a thing superhero films of that era did more or less compulsively. Ares as a villain does not really work. David Thewlis is a wonderful actor, and the film gives him a suit of glowing armour and a lot of shouting. But here is what I would say in its defence, and it is the same thing I would say about the whole film. The final fight is bad in a completely ordinary way. It is the standard failure mode of the genre. Everything before it is doing something nobody else was doing. The Themyscira material at the start is genuinely gorgeous, and there is a proper film in there about a mother trying to keep her daughter from finding out what she is for. Connie Nielsen and Robin Wright are both doing far more work than the script strictly requires. Chris Pine is doing the hardest job in the film, which is being the ordinary person in a story about a god. And he plays it with a kind of rumpled decency that makes the ending land. And the ice cream scene. Diana tastes ice cream for the first time and tells the vendor he should be very proud. 10 seconds. It tells you more about the character than an hour of exposition would, and it does it by being funny. That is the thing this franchise kept forgetting it was allowed to do. Not jokes bolted on, because the reviews said the last one was too grim. Just a moment where a person is delighted by something ordinary. Now, a bit of context that I think complicates the triumph slightly, and I want to be honest about it rather than tell you a neat story. There is a reading of Wonder Woman's success that says, look, this proves the standalone approach works, give directors films and leave them alone, and I broadly believe that reading. But the film also benefited from being the fourth entry rather than the first. The character had been introduced already. Gadot had been the most widely praised element of Batman v Superman, more or less unanimously, and she was in that film for about 7 minutes. So the solo film arrived with the audience already warm on her, and no obligation to spend 20 minutes explaining who she was, which is, in its way, an argument for the shared universe. The universe did the introduction, the standalone film did the rest. That is the model working exactly as designed once. Since we are here, a bit of history about the character herself, because I think it makes what happened in 2017 more impressive rather than less. Wonder Woman was created in 1941 by William Moulton Marston, who was a psychologist and who was also one of the people involved in developing an early version of the polygraph. Which is why she has a lasso that makes people tell the truth. That is not a coincidence. That is a man putting his day job in a comic. The character has been continuously in print since then, which puts her in an extremely small group. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. That is essentially the list of superheroes who have never gone away. And in 76 years she had never had a film. Not one. There had been the Linda Carter television series in the 70s, which is beloved and which is what most people over a certain age picture when they hear the name. There had been a rejected Joss Whedon script in the mid-2000s, funnily enough. There had been development deals that went nowhere for decades. Meanwhile, Batman had 8 films by 2017 and Superman had 6. The stated reason, whenever anyone asked, was always some version of the market being difficult, which usually meant hire Catwoman in 2004 and Elektra in 2005, both of which had been terrible, and both of which had been treated for over a decade as evidence about an entire category of film rather than as evidence about 2 bad films. So when Wonder Woman opened to 92% and $800 million, it was not just a good result for a superhero film. It closed an argument that had been running in that industry for 13 years and should never have been running at all. There is a detail from the release I have always liked. A number of cinemas, starting with the Alamo Drafthouse in Austin, ran women-only screenings in the opening week. This generated a genuinely enormous amount of shouting on the internet, in the way that everything does, and the screenings sold out immediately, and more were added. And by the end of the run, it had become a small tradition in a handful of places. It is the sort of thing that tells you a film has landed somewhere beyond the box office chart. I also think it is worth saying, because I have been fairly hard on Snyder's films tonight, and I want to be fair, that he has a story credit on Wonder Woman and produced it, and that Gal Gadot was cast by him in his film over some fairly loud objection at the time. Whatever you think of Batman v Superman, the single best decision anybody in this franchise ever made was made there. There is one other detail about the timing that I want to leave you with, and I am not going to do anything dramatic with it. It is just a fact that sits there. Wonder Woman came out on the 2nd of June 2017. Zack Snyder had stepped away from Justice League about a week earlier. So the studio's best reviewed film in years was in cinemas, and audiences were coming out of it delighted. And the general mood was that the corner had been turned at the exact moment that the film, meant to be the culmination of everything, was quietly changing hands. Behind the scenes, nobody in that audience knew. There was no reason for them to know. The two films are 5 months and about $165 million of budget apart, and they could not have gone more differently. We will get to that, but not with any drama about it, because there is nothing dramatic to do with what happened, and I would rather just tell it plainly. Justice League had been on the list since October 2014, with a 2017 date, and by the time it went into production, it was carrying more weight than any film in the franchise had carried before it. It was the payoff. It was the thing Batman v Superman had spent all those dream sequences setting up. It was, in the plan, the first half of a 2-part conclusion. Principal photography ran from April to October 2016 in London, mostly at Leavesden and Warner's UK facilities, and the script changed constantly. That is well documented, and not really in dispute from any side. Warner held what has been described as a footage summit, where writers including Joss Whedon and Wonder Woman screenwriter Alan Heinberg were shown material and asked for thoughts, and rewrites came out of that while the film was still shooting. The mandate coming down from the top was that the film should not run over 2 hours. That came directly from Kevin Sugihara. 2 hours for a film introducing 3 new leads, resurrecting a 4th, and running a global invasion plot. For scale, the Avengers film that Warner was implicitly measuring against ran 2 hours and 23 minutes, and it had 6 films of setup behind it. Then in March 2017, Zack Snyder's daughter, Autumn, died. I am going to handle this plainly, because I think that is the only respectful way to do it. Snyder initially kept working. He has said since that he tried to, and that the family was not in a state where that was sustainable. In May 2017, he stepped away from the film. His statement at the time was that he had decided to take a step back to be with his family, that his kids really needed him, that they were all having a hard time, and that he was having a hard time. Joss Whedon, who had directed both of the first 2 Avengers films, and who had already been brought in to write additional material, took over post-production, including reshoots. Warner's framing at the time was that this was a finishing job. Toby Emmerich, who ran the Warner Picture Group, said the directing was minimal and that it had to adhere to the style and tone and template that Snyder had set. That is not what happened. The reshoots ran for about 2 months across London and Los Angeles in the summer of 2017. Warner put roughly $25 million into them, against a typical additional photography spend of somewhere between 6 and 10. Whedon wrote dozens of pages of new material. Snyder himself, speaking to Total Film in 2021, gave the clearest account of the scale from his side, and it is a strange thing to read, because he is describing his own film secondhand. He said that because he had never seen the theatrical version, he did not know exactly what of his movie was in that movie, but he had heard from people who had been on his crew and then continued on that there was about an hour of reshoots. So he guessed they used about an hour of his footage and that they had pretty much touched every shot, whether for dialogue replacement or whatever else. An hour of reshoots on a 2-hour film. The budget came to about $300 million, which put it at the time among the 5 most expensive films ever made without adjusting for inflation. Marketing on top of that has been reported in the region of 150 to 175. And the moustache, right, this one deserves proper explanation because it is the detail everybody knows and almost nobody knows the reason for. By the summer of 2017, Henry Cavill was shooting Mission: Impossible Fallout, in which he plays a character with a substantial moustache. There is a whole sequence in that film built around it, the bit where he reloads his arms in a bathroom, which became its own meme. Paramount entirely reasonably had it written into his contract that he could not shave it mid-production, because you cannot grow a moustache back between Tuesday and Thursday. So when Warner needed Cavill for Justice League reshoots, he arrived with a moustache he was contractually forbidden to remove, and the choices were to shut down a Paramount film, to shoot around him, or to remove it digitally in post. They removed it digitally. It cost a reported several $1 million, and it looks, in the finished film, like Superman's upper lip belongs to a slightly different person. There is a stretch of about 20 minutes where you cannot look at anything else. Reportedly, Paramount at one point offered to work something out, and the two studios could not land on terms, which means one of the most mocked visual effects in blockbuster history is in the end a scheduling dispute. The film came out on the 17th of November, 2017. It opened to about $96 million domestically, which was below what Warner had been projecting. It finished at $657.9 million worldwide, 40% on Rotten Tomatoes. Now the money. The break-even point on this film has been estimated at as high as $750 million because of the budget and the marketing and the fact that a studio only sees roughly half of a ticket. Deadline's analysis put the net loss at around $60 million. So, the culmination of a 4-year plan, the film with Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman all on the poster together for the first time in history, lost money. And I think what is genuinely sad about the finished film is not that it is a disaster, it is that it is not much of anything. Batman v Superman is a lot of things, and several of them are bad, but it has a personality. Justice League has 2 personalities, and they have been mixed until neither is detectable. There are jokes that clearly arrived in the summer of 2017, sitting in scenes shot in the winter of 2016 that were built for a different film entirely. Steppenwolf as a villain is a large digital man who wants some boxes. Cyborg, who in the original plan was the emotional centre of the thing, is reduced to a function. There is a moment where Superman comes back and, for about 90 seconds, the film has an idea. He is confused, he is dangerous, and the Flash tries to sneak up on him, and Superman tracks the movement, which is the single best beat in the film, and then it resolves and moves on. The reception was strange too, because everyone could tell. You did not need the reporting to know something had happened to this film. The seams are visible from space, which meant that within days of release, the internet was doing forensic work on which shots belong to whom, and that forensic work never really stopped. There is a technical point about that 2-hour mandate that I think deserves more attention than it gets, because it is the kind of thing that sounds like a note, and is actually a structural decision. A theatrical runtime is not just an artistic question, it is a scheduling question. A 2-hour film gets more showings per screen per day than a 2.5-hour film does. Over a wide release, across thousands of screens across an opening weekend, that difference is worth real money. So there is a genuine commercial logic to wanting a shorter film, and studios have been applying that pressure for decades. The problem is that the logic only holds if people want to see the film. More showings of something nobody is buying tickets for is just more empty rooms. And the films that were beating Warner in that period were routinely running well over 2 hours, because by then the audience had decided that a long film was a sign of an event rather than a chore. So the mandate was solving a problem the film did not have, and creating one it did. You cannot introduce Cyborg, the Flash and Aquaman, resurrect Superman, run an invasion, and give 6 people arcs in 120 minutes. Something has to be cut, and what got cut was the connective material, which is the stuff that makes the rest make sense. That is, I think, the most consistent failure across this whole run. Not bad ideas. Compression. Batman v Superman had 30 minutes removed and lost its subplots. Suicide Squad had its cut assembled from 2 competing versions. Justice League had a number handed down before anyone knew what the film needed. The other thing about Justice League that struck me when I went back to it is how much of it takes place on sets that look like sets. There is a Russian village at the climax that has, as far as I can tell, 4 residents. There is a lot of orange sky. For $300 million, it does not look like $300 million, and that is because an enormous proportion of the money went on doing everything twice rather than on doing anything once. There is a small and slightly grim postscript to all of this that I want to include, which is what it did to the actors involved. Ray Fisher's entire film career to that point was Cyborg. He had been cast in 2014, filmed a role in Batman v Superman that was cut down to a few seconds of monitor footage, and was told he was building toward a solo film in 2020 that was on the published list. That solo film never happened. His part in Justice League was substantially reduced. That is 6 years of a person's professional life attached to a plan. We will come back to him because he has a good deal more to say about all this, and it happens rather later. I want to close this section on one thing Snyder said, because it is the detail that stayed with me most out of everything I read for this. He has never watched it. After Whedon's version was finished in late 2017, his wife Deborah, who produced the film, and Christopher Nolan, who had executive produced Man of Steel and remained a friend, both told him not to. They knew what it would do. The phrasing that has been reported is that they knew it would break his heart. So there is a version of this story in which a man spent 4 years building something, left it for the worst reason a person can leave anything, and then simply never saw what it became. He has talked about it since at length, and he still describes it as a film he has not seen, which is a very quiet thing to be sitting at the centre of the most expensive film of the year. Anyway, the film came and went in a few weeks, the way films do. What came out of it took considerably longer. John Berg left Warner Brothers in December 2017, about a month after the film came out. Jeff Johns departed from running DC Films the following June. So the 2 people hired in the spring of 2016 to bring order to the slate were both gone within about 2 years, and the thing they were hired to fix had, in the meantime, produced the biggest loss the franchise had recorded. That is not a knock on either of them personally, it is just the shape of it. Every time this franchise had a bad result, the response was a reorganisation, and every reorganisation started the clock again on somebody learning the job. Ben Affleck stepped away from Batman across roughly the same period. He had been attached to write and direct a solo film, then stepped back from directing in January 2017, then out of the role entirely by early 2019. He has been fairly candid since about how difficult that stretch of his life was, and about the pressure of the whole thing. Matt Reeves took the project and rebuilt it from the ground up as something entirely separate, which eventually became The Batman with Robert Pattinson in 2022, and which is not part of this story at all, and is a large part of why DC's overall position was never as bad as the DCEU's position. Meanwhile, the internet had found something to do. The hashtag started almost immediately. Release the Snyder Cut. In the first months, it was mostly a joke, or at least mostly people who were half joking, because nobody knew whether a Snyder version of the film even existed in any watchable form. The reshoots had happened during post-production, which meant Snyder's assembly had never gone through the finishing process. No completed visual effects, no final score. In a lot of it, the actors are standing in front of green screens, with nothing on them. Then over a couple of years it grew into something else entirely. Billboards, a plane with a banner, cast members chiming in, Jason Momoa saying he had seen it, and it was, his word, sick. Ben Affleck and Gal Gadot posting the hashtag in November 2019, which was the point at which it stopped being a fan thing and started being a thing. I want to be even-handed about that campaign, because it is genuinely hard to characterize. There was a real, large, sincere group of people who wanted to see a film they believed existed, and there is nothing wrong with that at all. There was also, by later analysis, a meaningful amount of automated amplification in the hashtag traffic, which several studies and news investigations have since reported on. And there was, at the harder edges of it, a stretch of behaviour toward journalists and executives that a lot of the people involved would probably rather not revisit. All of those things were true at the same time, which is normally how these things go. Now, the more serious thread from this period, and I am going to lay it out carefully and attribute everything to whoever said it. In late June 2020, Ray Fisher, who played Cyborg, publicly retracted praise he had given Whedon at Comic-Con in 2017. Days later, he went further. His statement was that Whedon's on-set treatment of the cast and crew of Justice League had been gross, abusive, unprofessional, and completely unacceptable, and that he had been enabled in many ways by Jeff Johns and John Berg. Berg responded that it was categorically untrue that they had enabled any unprofessional behaviour. Whedon did not comment at that stage. Fisher kept going through July, saying at a fan convention that he was undergoing a process to get to the heart of everything, and adding that if anything he had said about that man was untrue, he invited him wholeheartedly to sue for libel or slander. In August 2020, Warner Media launched an investigation. Fisher described it as an independent third-party investigation into what he characterized as a toxic and abusive work environment created during the reshoots. A source told Variety that the company had not prejudged anyone, that the investigation was not limited to the 3 named individuals, and that it would not be conducted in public. Fisher also made a broader allegation that racist conversations had been had and entertained on multiple occasions by former and current top-level executives, and he named Johns, Berg, and Toby Emmerich. He later disputed the studio's account of a conversation he said he had with Walter Hamada, who by then ran DC Films. The investigation concluded on the 11th of December 2020. Warner Media's public statement was 1 sentence long. The investigation into the Justice League movie had concluded, and remedial action had been taken. That is it. That is the entire public account. Variety pressed for detail, and the company declined to give any. Nobody outside the process knows what remedial action means, who it applied to, or what was found. Fisher's response at the time was that we are on our way. The following month, January 2021, Cyborg was removed from The Flash. Warner did not connect the two things, and Fisher did. Whedon eventually spoke to New York Magazine in early 2022. He said none of Fisher's claims were either true or merited discussing, and used the phrase a malevolent force. He had by then also left his HBO series The Nevers in November 2020, a couple of weeks before the investigation wrapped up. I am not going to adjudicate any of this, because I cannot, and because a 1-sentence corporate statement is specifically designed to make adjudication impossible. What I will say is that the whole episode is a decent illustration of something that runs through this entire story, which is how little of what happens at a studio is ever actually explained to the people watching the films. There is a version of these events in a court transcript somewhere or in an HR file, and it will almost certainly never be public. Right. So, against all of that, in May 2020, Warner announced that the Snyder Cut was real and was coming. Zack Snyder's Justice League went up on HBO Max on the 18th of March, 2021. 4 hours and 2 minutes, divided into 6 chapters with title cards. Shot, or rather presented, in a 1.33 to 1 aspect ratio, which is nearly square because Snyder had originally framed it with IMAX in mind and refused to crop it. So you had a streaming film with black bars down both sides, which nobody had done, and which a lot of people had to be talked out of thinking was a technical fault. The additional spend on completing it has been reported at around $70 million, on top of the roughly $300 the first version cost. Some of that was finishing visual effects that had never been finished. Some of it was new material, including a substantial amount involving Darkseid, who had been almost entirely absent from the theatrical film. And I have to be honest with you about my own reaction, because the style rules I set myself say I have to have opinions. It is not a good film. It is a fascinating one. It is baggy in a way that is occasionally glorious and frequently tiring. There is a sequence early on where a scream travels across the world in slow motion for what feels like several minutes. The epilogue goes on for about 25 minutes after the plot has finished, setting up sequels that were never going to be made. But it is coherent, that is the thing. Whatever else you say, it is one person's film from start to end. And after watching the 2017 version, coherence is a genuine relief. Cyborg has an arc. The Flash has a personality. Steppenwolf has a reason to be there, and a boss to be frightened of. And Junkie XL's score, which had been thrown out entirely and replaced by Danny Elfman, is back and doing an enormous amount of work. What I keep thinking about is that this was, as far as I know, unprecedented. A major studio spent $70 million to complete an alternative version of a film it had already released and lost money on, because people on the internet asked for it for 3 years. There is no precedent for that. There is not really a follow-up either, despite a lot of people trying to start one for other films since. There is a business question underneath the Snyder Cut that I find more interesting than the film, actually, and it is this: why would a company do that? The answer is HBO Max. Warner had launched its streaming service in May 2020 into a market where Netflix and Disney Plus already existed, and where the whole industry had decided that subscriber numbers were the only figure that mattered. Everything a media company did in 2020 and 2021 was aimed at that one number. Share prices moved on it, and a 4-hour exclusive version of a film that a very loud group of people had been demanding for 3 years is, from that angle, not a creative decision at all. It is a subscriber acquisition campaign with a director attached. $70 million is a lot of money for a film, and a fairly ordinary amount of money for a marketing push on a new platform. I do not say that cynically, exactly. Snyder got to finish his film. That is a real thing, and I am glad it exists. But it is worth understanding that it happened because of a specific 18-month window in which streaming subscribers were the most valuable thing in the industry. And that window closed almost immediately afterwards, which is why nothing like it has happened since, despite roughly 400 campaigns asking for it. The other thing that period produced, and this is the part I think will actually turn out to matter historically, is a permanent change in the relationship between studios and audiences. Before 2021, the general assumption was that a film was a film. You saw the version you were given. There were director's cuts, obviously. They had existed for decades, but they arrived quietly on home video years later, and nobody organised for them. After 2021, the assumption changed. If a version of a film exists that you did not get, a campaign for it is now a normal thing to start, and studios have to have a position on it. Every troubled production since has generated one. There is one for the Air cut of Suicide Squad, as I mentioned. There have been campaigns for versions of films from studios who have said flatly that no such version exists, Whether that is good for cinema, I genuinely have no idea. It is nice when it produces a thing someone worked hard on. It is less nice when it produces 3 years of abuse aimed at a marketing department. Probably both of those will keep being true. Warner made it very clear afterwards that this was the end of the road. There was a phrase used at the time about the Snyder story being a road not travelled. Whatever came next was not going to continue from it, which was true, but it slightly obscures what was actually going on at the time, because while all of this was happening, the franchise had quietly been having its best years commercially, and almost nobody talks about it. Here is the bit of this story that gets skipped, and I think it is genuinely the most interesting stretch of the whole run. After Justice League, Warner Brothers stopped trying to build a universe. Not officially. Nobody put out a press release saying, "We are abandoning the plan." But the plan was abandoned, and what replaced it was, roughly, make individual films, keep the budgets sensible, let the directors have the tone they want, and stop worrying about whether any of it connects. Walter Hamada came in to run DC Films in early 2018, having come from New Line, where he had produced the Conjuring films. He was, by reputation, a low-budget horror guy who knew how to make things for money, which, after a $300 million film that lost 60, is a fairly pointed hire, and the first thing out of the door under that approach was Aquaman in December 2018, which made $1.14 billion. That is still the record. Nothing in this franchise, before or since, has come close. It is the only DCEU film to pass $1 billion out of 15, and it did it with James Wan, who is also a horror director, doing whatever he liked. And what he liked was, apparently, everything. Aquaman is a film in which a man rides a shark. There is an octopus playing the drums. There is a giant sea monster, voiced by Julie Andrews. Willem Dafoe has long flowing hair and rides some sort of aquatic dinosaur. 2 characters have a conversation in an underwater trench that is essentially a horror movie for 10 minutes. And at one point, Jason Momoa punches a submarine. It is completely unembarrassed. That is the thing. Every other film in this franchise to that point had been visibly worried about how it would be received. Aquaman was not worried about anything. It puts Nicole Kidman in a green rubber suit, fighting soldiers in her own living room in the first 15 minutes, and it does not pause to check whether you are on board. And 1 billion people said yes, more or less immediately, and I do not think Warner Bros. Has ever properly worked out why. Since we are on the subject of Hamada, I want to say a fair word about him, because he ends up as a footnote in most versions of this story, and I do not think that is right. He took over a division that had just lost money on the biggest film it had ever made, with a lead actor walking away from Batman, a slate full of titles that had been announced years earlier and never developed, and a public conversation that had turned entirely against the brand. And the approach he brought was, essentially, stop being a universe, make films, keep the budgets in a range where a normal result is a profit rather than a crisis, hire people who have a specific idea and get out of their way, which is not a glamorous strategy. Nobody stands on a stage at Comic-Con and announces that the plan is sensible budgets. But it produced the highest grossing film in the franchise, a profitable Shazam, a very well-liked Suicide Squad film, and a Batman reboot with Matt Reeves that went on to make about $770 million in 2022. That is a decent 5 years of work by any measure, and his reward for it was to be there when the company changed hands and the whole thing got taken apart around him. There is one other thing about that stretch that I think gets missed, which is how different all the films look from each other. Line them up. Aquaman is a saturated undersea fantasy epic. Shazam is a suburban Christmas comedy that is occasionally a horror film about a man with 7 demons in his head. Birds of Prey is a neon-lit crime picture with a broken timeline. The Suicide Squad is a war film with a lot of blood in it and a rat in it. Nothing about those 4 films suggests they came from the same building, and that is the point. There is no house style. There is no obligation for the 4th one to acknowledge the 2nd one. Nobody is doing homework. The comparison everyone always reaches for is Marvel. And Marvel's whole strength in that period was the opposite, which is that everything did connect, and every film paid off the last one. So it is genuinely interesting that the moment Warner stopped trying to compete on that ground and started doing something completely different, the results got better almost immediately. Whether that would have held up over another 5 years, I have no idea. It did not get another 5 years. Then Shazam in April 2019 made for about 100 million, which by superhero standards is nothing. A body swap comedy where a foster kid says a magic word and turns into a grown man with powers, and the actual subject of the film is foster care and what family means. It is warm and small and genuinely funny, and it made about 367 million, which on that budget is a proper hit. Then Birds of Prey in February 2020 made for around 84 million, R-rated, directed by Kathy Yan, with Margot Robbie doing Harley Quinn again, but this time in a film built entirely around her sensibility. It did about 200 million, which is fine rather than spectacular, and it has aged extremely well. The Ewan McGregor performance in that is doing something a lot of superhero villains never manage, which is being genuinely unpleasant to be around. And running alongside all of this, entirely outside the DCEU, there was Joker, October 2019. Todd Phillips, Joaquin Phoenix, made for about 55 to 70 million, depending on the report. No connection to anything, no shared universe obligations whatsoever. It made over $1 billion, won Phoenix an Academy Award, and became at the time the highest grossing R-rated film in history. I bring it up because of what it proved, which is that the problem was never DC. The characters were fine. The library was fine. The audience was there. A film about a DC character, made cheaply, with a specific director's voice, entirely disconnected from any slate, made more money than the film with Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman on the poster together. So by the start of 2020, you have a situation that, if you squint, looks like a recovery. $1 billion Aquaman, a profitable Shazam, a well-liked Birds of Prey, $1 billion Joker on the side, a Batman reboot in production with Matt Reeves, and a Snyder Cut announced for streaming. The strategy had changed, and it was working. And then, obviously, the world shut, which is where this section gets genuinely annoying to talk about, because 2 films came out in the middle of it, and their numbers tell you almost nothing about the films. Wonder Woman 1984 was released on Christmas Day 2020, in whatever cinemas were open, and simultaneously on HBO Max in the United States, at no extra cost to subscribers. It cost about 200 million, and it made about 169 million worldwide. On paper, that is a catastrophe. In practice, it is a number produced by releasing a film for free into people's houses during a pandemic. There is no way to know what that film would have made in a normal year. There is not even a good way to guess. What I will say, having a strong opinion as promised, is that I do not think it was very good regardless. It has a wonderful first 20 minutes, and then a plot involving a wishing stone that requires everybody to behave increasingly strangely. And the way it brings Chris Pine back is a decision I have never been able to get past. Kristen Wiig is doing her absolute best. Pedro Pascal is having the time of his life, playing a man who is essentially a 1984 infomercial. But the film that made me cry in 2017 made me check my phone in 2020, and I do not think you can put all of that on the pandemic. The same model applied to the Suicide Squad in August 2021. James Gunn, freshly and briefly fired by Marvel, and then quietly picked up by Warner, made a very violent, very funny, completely standalone film with a giant starfish in it, which is probably the best reviewed thing the franchise produced after Wonder Woman. It made about $168 million on the same day and date streaming release, in a summer when the Delta wave was making people think twice about cinemas. 2 films, both released into an environment that made their box office meaningless, both now permanently listed among the lowest grossing entries in the franchise, and the strategy underneath them, which was working, got tarred with numbers that were never really about the films. Since we are on the subject of Aquaman, I want to spend a bit longer on it, because I think it is the most underanalyzed film in this entire story, and everyone treats it as a punchline. It came out on the 21st of December 2018 in the United States, but it had already opened in China 2 weeks earlier, on the 7th. That was a deliberate choice, and it worked extraordinarily well. The film made close to $300 million in China alone, which is more than most superhero films make worldwide, and it did that before the American release had even started, which is worth pausing on, because it makes Aquaman something quite unusual. A film whose success was substantially built on a market that Hollywood, at the time, was still learning how to read. James Wan is Malaysian-Australian and had a considerable existing profile there. The film is a big, colourful mythological adventure with clear archetypes and enormous visual scale, which travels far better across a subtitle than a film built on dialogue does. The other thing about it is the craft, which people skip over because of the shark. One came out of horror, and horror directors are usually excellent at geography, at making you understand where everyone is in a space and what is behind them. There is a sequence in Sicily where Aquaman and Mera are chased across rooftops, and the camera appears to hand off from one of them to the other and back again in what looks like a single continuous move. It is stitched together, obviously, but it is a genuinely ambitious piece of blocking, and nobody talks about it because 10 minutes later, a crab the size of a house turns up. And there is a real thematic thing in there too, underneath the octopus. It is a film about a person who belongs to 2 places and is told by both of them that he is not really from there. Momoa plays that with more delicacy than the film strictly requires. I think what happened is that the film's total lack of self-consciousness, which is its greatest strength, made it very easy to dismiss. It is not cool. It does not want to be. And it made more money than any other DC film ever has, and I suspect that if it had come out in a slightly different order in this story, we would talk about it completely differently. There is a corporate layer to this that matters, and I will keep it brief because it is dry. AT&T had bought Time Warner in 2018. Under AT&T, and specifically under Jason Keeler, who came in to run Warner Media in 2020, the priority became HBO Max. That is why the day and date releases happened, over the loud objections of basically every director involved. And it is why films started getting greenlit at streaming budgets rather than theatrical ones. So by early 2022, you had a DC slate that was being built for a streaming service by a company that had recently bought the studio, under a strategy that was about 18 months old. And in April 2022, the company was sold again. Warner Bros. Discovery came into existence on the 8th of April 2022, when AT&T spun off Warner Media and merged it with Discovery. The new company was run by David Zaslav, who had spent 17 years running Discovery, a business built on reality and factual programming and cost discipline. He arrived with about $55 billion of debt attached to the new company and a stated target of $3 billion in cuts. 4 months in, on the 2nd of August 2022, Warner Bros. Announced it would not be releasing Batgirl, not delaying it, not moving it to streaming, not putting it out quietly in February, just not releasing it anywhere, which was, as far as anyone could establish at the time, without precedent at that budget level. Films get shelved reasonably often, but usually they are unfinished or cheap, or both. The film was essentially finished. It had been shot in Glasgow, directed by Adil El Arbi and Bilal Fallah, who had just made Bad Boys for Life, with Leslie Grace in the lead, J.K. Simmons back as Commissioner Gordon, Brendan Fraser as the villain, and Michael Keaton returning as Batman for the first time since 1992. It was in post-production. There were assembled cuts, people had seen it. It had been greenlit at around $80 million under the Keelar streaming strategy as an HBO Max exclusive, and the budget had risen to about $90 million because of COVID protocols, which by 2022 had added money to essentially everything, and it was taken as a write-down. Now I want to explain what that actually means, because a lot of the coverage at the time treated it as though the studio had simply thrown $90 million in a bin out of spite. A write-down is an accounting move. If you release a film and it loses money, you take the loss as it comes, over time, against revenue. If you abandon a film before release, you can write the entire cost off in one go against that period's income, which reduces the tax you pay on everything else. There is a genuine, calculable financial case for it, and a tax lawyer quoted at the time in Newsweek laid it out in exactly those terms. The loss from Batgirl reduces taxable income. The catch is that it is essentially irreversible. Once you have taken the write-down, releasing the film later becomes a serious problem, because you have told the tax authorities the asset has no value. So the film is not shelved in the sense of being on a shelf. It is closer to being legally deleted. In a filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission that October, Warner Bros. Discovery flagged a write-off of between $2 and $2.5 billion for the July to September quarter, raised by cancelling films and shelving television. Batgirl was one item on a longer list. Scoob, Holiday Haunt went the same way. So did a Wonder Twins film, and a Supergirl project, and a fair amount of animation, including a Batman, Caped Crusader series that thankfully found another home later on. Walter Hamada left DC Films over it, and the framing from the new leadership afterwards is, I think, worth hearing in full, because it is a remarkable pair of sentences to put next to each other. Peter Safran, speaking at a press event in Burbank the following January, said that the film was not releasable and that it happens sometimes. And then he said that Zaslav had made a very bold and courageous decision to cancel it, because it would have hurt DC, and it would have hurt those people involved. Bold and courageous. About not releasing a film that a few hundred people spent a year making. I do not doubt he meant it as a defence of a difficult call, and there is a real argument that a bad Batgirl in 2022 would have done more damage than no Batgirl at all. But there is something about hearing an unreleased film described as an act of courage that I have not been able to shake. Leslie Grace, for what it is worth, handled it with more grace than anyone else involved. She posted afterwards that she had gotten to be her own damn hero. There is a bit of context about Zaslav himself that I think makes all of this more legible, and it is not a criticism so much as a description. He had spent his career in cable and factual television. Discovery's business model was built on making a large volume of programming very efficiently and licensing it everywhere. That is a genuinely difficult thing to do well, and he was extremely good at it. But it is a completely different discipline from running a film studio where the economics are lumpy and unpredictable, and where a single title can carry a year. And the company he arrived at was carrying an enormous amount of debt from the transaction that created it, which meant the first job was not creative at all. It was balance sheet. When your first priority is $3 billion of savings, an unreleased film sitting in post-production is not a piece of art with a problem. It is a line item with a number next to it. I think that explains more of the following 18 months than any argument about taste does. It is also why the same thing happened again the following year, in November 2023, to an animated Looney Tunes film called Coyote vs. Acme, which was finished, which people who had seen it were extremely enthusiastic about, and which was written down for a reported $30 million. That one caused enough of a public reaction that the studio eventually allowed it to be shopped elsewhere, which is a small improvement on the Batgirl outcome. The other thing worth saying, and I will say it once, is that none of this is unique to Warner Brothers. Every large media company in that period was doing some version of the same arithmetic. It is just that Warner had recently spent a decade telling everybody it was building a superhero universe. So when the arithmetic arrived, it arrived on top of a very public promise. Discovery did not have that problem because nobody had ever been emotionally invested in the release schedule for a home renovation program. Right, 2.5 months later, Black Adam came out. This one is a proper story, and it hinges almost entirely on one man's plan. Dwayne Johnson had been attached to Black Adam since about 2007, 15 years. It was, by his own repeated account, the passion project of his career, and he approached it not as a film, but as a strategy. The line he used constantly through the marketing, and I mean constantly, in tweets, in interviews, on posters, was that the hierarchy of power in the DC universe is about to change. The specific plan was to bring back Henry Cavill. Cavill had not played Superman since 2017. Warner, under multiple regimes, had not wanted him back, and there had been years of on and off reporting about whether a Man of Steel sequel would ever happen. Johnson lobbied hard. He and Cavill shared a manager, which helped. The reporting is that a version of the post-credits scene was tested showing Superman only in silhouette, and that Johnson and the director Jaume Collet Serra pushed to make it the real thing. And they got it. Black Adam opened on the 21st of October, 2022, and it ended with Henry Cavill in the suit saying he was back. The cinema I was in made a noise. It worked. Johnson said afterwards that there was no other Superman to bring back, that Cavill was our generation's Superman, and respectfully to the other actors, and especially to Christopher Reeve, the greatest of all time. Which is an extremely Dwayne Johnson sentence, and I mean that fondly. The film made about $390 million worldwide. On a budget reported anywhere from 190 to 260 million, depending on which outlet you read, plus marketing, that is a loss. And roughly a week after it opened, Warner Bros. Discovery announced that James Gunn and Peter Safran would be co-heads of a new DC Studios. Gunn, who had made the Suicide Squad and the Guardians films, Safran, who had produced Aquaman and Shazam and the Conjuring films, given full creative authority over film, television and animation, reporting to Zaslav. 2 months after that, in December 2022, Henry Cavill announced he would not be returning as Superman after all. Gunn was already writing a Superman film about a younger version of the character. The cameo that Dwayne Johnson had spent years engineering had a shelf life of about 8 weeks. Johnson's response when Variety caught him on a red carpet the following March is the best summary of the whole situation anyone has produced. He said it was almost like when you have a pro football team and your quarterback wins championships and your head coach wins championships, and then a new owner comes in and says, "Not my coach, not my quarterback, I am going to go with somebody new." He has also said on Kevin Hart's show that Black Adam got caught in a vortex of new leadership, and that there had been so many changes in leadership while they were creating, developing and shooting it. Which is true, and it is the same complaint that has been running underneath this entire story since 2016. The people in charge kept changing, and every new set of people inherited films that had been made for the previous set. There is one more thing about that autumn that I want to include, because it is the part that gets least attention and is arguably the most consequential. Gunn and Safran were not brought in to run a division. They were brought in to run a studio with authority over film, television, animation and games, reporting straight to the top. That is a structure Warner had not had for DC at any point in the previous decade, and it is very close to the structure the competition had built in 2007 and stuck with ever since, which means the actual fix, when it finally came, was not a creative fix, it was an org chart. And I do find something slightly bleak about that. 10 years, 15 films, 4 sets of leadership, several $1 billion of production, and the eventual answer was to put 2 people in charge of everything and let them stay there. That was available in 2013. It was available in 2016 when they made DC films and then changed who ran it twice. It was available at any point. The thing that made it hard was not that nobody thought of it, it was that a shared universe requires somebody to have authority over films they are not personally making for years at a time, and studios are structurally quite bad at giving anyone that. Directors want their own film. Executives rotate. Chief executives change. Whole companies get sold, twice in 4 years. The other detail from that period worth mentioning is what happened to the Snyder-era cast in fairly short order. Gal Gadot's third Wonder Woman film was reported as not going ahead because Patty Jenkins' pitch did not match the new plan. Cavill was out, as we have covered. Affleck's Batman had already gone. Momoa has since been reported as moving to a different character in the new continuity, which is a genuinely novel solution to the problem of liking an actor but not their role. Viola Davis, as I mentioned earlier, stayed. So did John Cena's Peacemaker, whose television show Gunn had already made and which turned out to be the first thing to survive the transition. Which is a strange pair of survivors from a decade of films about Superman and Batman, and I mean that affectionately. By the end of 2022, Gunn and Safran had inherited 4 finished films with release dates already booked, belonging to a continuity that was no longer going to continue. Which is an odd thing to have on your desk in your first week, and it is where 2023 starts from. 2023 is one of the strangest release years any franchise has had, because everybody involved knew the ending in advance. 4 films came out. All 4 were made under a plan that no longer existed, and the people marketing them had already publicly announced that the universe they belonged to was being replaced. Shazam! Fury of the Gods came first in March. David Sandberg back directing, Zachary Levi back in the suit, Helen Mirren and Lucy Liu as the villains, which on paper is a lovely idea. Made for about $125 million, it made around $134 million worldwide, which once you account for marketing and the cinema's share, is a substantial loss. It opened to about $30 million domestically, and then fell away almost immediately. Sandberg had said publicly, before release, that whether there would be more Shazam films depended on whether this one made money, which is a rare bit of honesty from a director, and which turned out to be a fairly short conversation. The film is fine. That is the frustrating thing. It is not a disaster. It is a slightly overstuffed sequel to a small charming film, and it is exactly the sort of thing that in 2019 would have done modest business and nobody would have thought about again. Coming out in March 2023 into a market where DC had just announced its own replacement, it did not have a chance. Then in June, The Flash. I have to lay out the run-up to this one properly, because the gap between what was said and what happened is the widest in this entire story. James Gunn, in January 2023, newly in charge, called it probably one of the greatest superhero movies ever made. Stephen King said that while he does not care much about superhero films, this one is special. And in April at CinemaCon in Las Vegas, David Zaslav stood in front of a room of theatre owners and told them it was the best superhero film he had ever seen. Zaslav did not have to do that. The film was made by the previous regime. He could have stood well back from it. Instead, he leaned all the way in and reportedly arranged for Tom Cruise to watch it, whose positive reaction became a talking point on the press tour. By late April, projections had The Flash opening at $100 million or more. It opened to $55.1 million. Warner's own internal expectation going in had come down to 70 or 75, and it missed even that. For context on how bad 55 is for a film of that size, it is roughly level with Watchmen's opening in 2009, and only a couple of million above Green Lantern in 2011, and neither of those figures is adjusted for inflation. It finished at somewhere around 270 million worldwide, against a budget reported between 200 and 220 million, and it is regularly listed as one of the largest losses in the history of the genre. There are several reasons, and I do not think any single one of them is the answer. The obvious one is Ezra Miller, whose behaviour between 2020 and 2022 had generated a run of headlines and arrests that made the studio's position essentially untenable. Miller issued a statement in August 2022, apologising and describing an intense period of crisis and complex mental health issues, and then largely did not do press for the film. Which is the other half of the problem. Warner had to open a $200 million film with its lead unavailable to promote it. The audience breakdown afterwards was reportedly around 73% adult men, which is far outside the normal range for a film like this, and which tells you fairly plainly who decided not to come. There is a second reason though, which the director Andy Muschietti has since been quite candid about. A lot of people simply do not care about the Flash as a character. He has said as much in interviews that he found in private conversations that people were not attached to him. And there is a third, which is that the film's whole selling point was nostalgia. Michael Keaton returning as Batman after 31 years. And the way that idea was executed in the final act, with a sequence of digitally recreated actors, including the late Christopher Reeve, landed for a great many people as ghoulish rather than moving. The visual effects in that stretch were widely criticised, and Muschietti's defence that they were meant to look unreal because you're seeing them through the distortion of the multiverse did not really take. Then Blue Beetle in August, which is the one I feel worst about, made for about 104 million, directed by Angel Manuel Soto, starring Xolo Maridueña as Jaime Reyes, and built around a Mexican-American family in a way no superhero film had been before. Susan Sarandon plays the villain and appears to be having a marvellous time. Damian Alcazar and Adriana Barraza as the parents are genuinely lovely. Most people who saw it liked it. It has warm reviews, and it made about $128 million worldwide, which makes it the lowest grossing film in the entire franchise. The reasons are not mysterious. The character was unknown outside comics readers, the marketing was thin, and the film arrived in the middle of the actors' strike, which meant the cast could not promote it at all. It also arrived 9 months after the audience had been told the whole thing was ending. And then, at Christmas, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, which is, in its way, the correct film to finish on, because it is the sequel to the only film in the run that ever cleared $1 billion. James Wan back directing, Jason Momoa back, and a production that had been repeatedly reworked as the ground shifted underneath it. Both Michael Keaton and Ben Affleck reportedly shot Batman cameos for it at different points, depending on which version of the future was current that month, and neither appears in the finished film. It made about $434 million worldwide against a reported budget of somewhere between 205 and 215 million, which puts it right around the break-even line, and which made it, by a distance, the best performing DC film in 5 years. It also means the franchise's final entry outgrossed everything since 2018 and still counts as a disappointment, which is a fairly good summary of where expectations had ended up. So, 15 theatrical films, from June 2013 to December 2023. 8 of them failed to break even in cinemas. 1 of them passed $1 billion. That is the accounting, and I am only going to say it once. There is a wider bit of context for 2023 that I have been holding back, because I did not want it to sound like an excuse, and it is not one, but it is real. That year was rough for the whole genre, not just for DC. Marvel had a difficult 12 months of its own. Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania opened enormously and then fell off a cliff. The Marvels in November had the lowest opening weekend of any film that studio had released. The phrase everyone reached for was superhero fatigue, which I've never entirely believed as an explanation, because Guardians of the Galaxy Fallen Earth 3 came out the same year and made close to $850 million, and Spider-Man had done well over $1 billion 2 years earlier. What I think was actually happening is a bit less mystical. The audience had simply stopped turning up by default. For about 12 years, a superhero film opening was an event you attended and then decided about afterwards. By 2023, people were waiting to hear whether it was any good, and if the answer was that it was fine, they waited for streaming instead. Which is not fatigue. That is just an audience behaving normally, the way audiences behave about every other kind of film. What was unusual was the decade before, when they did not. And the studios had built their entire economics around that decade. $200 million budgets only work if a large number of people show up without needing to be persuaded. The moment persuasion was required, a lot of films that would have been comfortable hits in 2016 became losses. DC got hit harder by that shift than anyone, partly because the 4 films it had in 2023 were made under an old plan, and partly because it had spent a decade training its own audience to be skeptical. If you have been told for years that the next one will fix it, and it has not, you become exactly the sort of viewer who waits to hear. There is one number from that year I find genuinely poignant. The final film in this franchise, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, outgrossed everything DC had released since 2018, and it was still spoken about as a disappointment. That is what a decade of expectation inflation does. A perfectly respectable result arrives, and nobody can see it properly because of where the goalposts have ended up. I do not think there is a lesson at the end of this, and I am slightly suspicious of the versions of this story that arrive at one. The neat version says, the films were too dark, and that is not really true, because the 2 biggest hits in the run are a film about a woman crossing a trench and a film about a man punching a submarine, and neither of those is dark. The other neat version says corporate greed ruined art, which is closer, but greed is a strange word for what was mostly just anxiety. People being frightened of the last set of reviews, and moving quickly, and moving again. What I keep landing on instead is a much smaller thought, which is that most of these films never got to be about themselves. Batman v Superman was also a Justice League trailer. Suicide Squad was also a tone correction. Justice League was also a runtime target. Black Adam was also somebody's 15-year plan for a franchise. The 2 that worked best were the 2 that had the least to carry. But the films exist, and that is the thing I find genuinely nice about all of this. The DCEU is finished now. It is a closed object, 15 films in a fixed order, which will be exactly the same tonight and in 20 years. Nobody is going to renumber them or fold them into anything. Whatever you thought of them at the time is still available for you to go and check. And for what it is worth, the reboot went fine. Superman came out in July 2025, David Corenswet in the suit, Gunn directing, and it opened to $122 million domestically and finished somewhere around $616 million worldwide, with reviews in the 80s, which is a good result, and more to the point, an ordinary one. A film came out and people liked it and it made money. That is all any of this was ever trying to do. There is a lot more in this world I did not get to. I skipped past the Batman almost entirely, and Joker's sequel, and the whole run of DC animated films. which are frankly better than most of what we talked about tonight, and which I would quite like to make a proper video about at some point. And there is a version of this with a lot more time spent on Aquaman, because I think that film is genuinely under-discussed as a piece of craft, but that is where we will leave it for tonight. 10 years, 15 films, one press release with some dates on it that turned out not to be dates at all. Sleep